Yes.
Okay.
I think we might see your presenter view.
Oh, you see my presenter view?
Is this presenter view? Oh, yeah, it is.
Try that.
That looks
There we go.
better.
That's weird. Well, I can't see my notes, but that's okay. I don't really have any notes, so that's good. My cursor's everywhere.
That's okay. So, I mean, there might be some people that will come in late, but you can start whenever you want to.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to talk about a few studies, and I think what I'll do is I'll like pause after each one in case people have questions, and that'll kind of keep you guys awake, and it'll just, well, it'll be less boring. And that way you won't forget, like, oh yeah, I wanted to ask a question about the first study or something, but alrighty. Okay. Do you guys see yourselves on, like, I see Zoom. I'll just do that.
We don't see your Zoom overlay.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay, good. All right. Yeah. Okay. So I thought I would talk about some studies looking at hemispheric asymmetry and joke comprehension. Because that's kind of my main interest, is how do people construct meaning from language? And if you think about it, you know, one of the things presumably that happens when you hear language is you're building a cognitive model of what the person's talking about. So for example, if you hear an utterance like this one, when I asked the bartender for something cold and full of rum, he recommended, you're building a cognitive model of what's happening, right? And you're recruiting background knowledge about bartenders and the kinds of interactions that they have. And you're drawing inferences from those background knowledge, right? For example, here it seems like the speaker is a customer interacting with a bartender, right? Even though it doesn't say, I was a customer in a bar and I asked the bartender for something, right? And so you're using your background knowledge to understand what's happening and to kind of make predictions about what's coming next, right? So in this case, you use your knowledge of why people talk to bartenders to kind of infer what's happening. And the most natural assumption would be you're looking for a drink recommendation, right? And so you build this mental model of a speaker asking a bartender a question, and that's what the cue is. And the cue is, you know, recommend a drink that has the properties of being cold and being full of rum. And then if the sentence actually ends with, he recommended his wife, you have to kind of dramatically reorganize what's happening in this situation. And so this is a process that I call frame shifting. Right. And so frame shifting is semantic or pragmatic reanalysis that reorganizes the existing elements in the message level representation into a new frame. Right. So the idea is you start with this representation here of a customer asking a bartender to recommend a particular kind of drink. Right. And then when you hear the bartender's reply, you have to call up a new set of background information in the form of a different frame, right? A data structure for representing common sense knowledge. And you have an entirely new perspective on the situation, right? So before, the customer is asking for a request and they're expecting to get a recommendation from the bartender. And here your whole understanding is that the bartender is now rendering an insult about his wife, even though she's not necessarily present in the situation, right? And so then the understanding of the idea of cold and full of rum takes on a totally new meaning, right? So instead of a cold drink, you're thinking like, oh, okay, cold means frigid, and full of rum means that she's an alcoholic, right? Even though that's not really a conventional way of referring to an alcoholic, given all the situations you're able to kind of build this representation. Right, so this frame shifting process and the fact that people seem to be able to understand these kinds of sentences really easily really highlight the importance of background knowledge for the comprehension of language and the development of expectations. And it reveals really a remarkable flexibility in the interpretive processes, right? So we're able to integrate information from an initial erroneous interpretation with new information that comes in the punchline, right? And the surprise aspect of jokes isn't just that the words don't mean what you initially think that they mean, right? So part of the joke is inferring a new meaning for cold, inferring a new meaning for full of rum, but also that the whole scenario is different from what you've assumed. And this is why I think that jokes are kind of an interesting thing to study. Okay, and jokes are also interesting from the perspective of hemispheric asymmetry that we know about most directly from the different kinds of consequences of brain damage. So if you have a stroke that impacts the left side of your brain and it affects communicative processes, it tends to result in pretty dramatic differences in really basic aspects of communication, right? So producing speech, coming up with the right word, stringing words together into a grammatical utterance. By contrast, if you have damage that impacts the right hemisphere, right? So you have a right hemisphere stroke, oftentimes the impact on everyday use of language is pretty negligible, but it does result in some interesting high-level communicative deficits. And rather than like the hardcore nuts and bolts aspects of language that are impacted by damage to the left hemisphere, if you have damage that impacts the right hemisphere cortex, you see problems with connected discourse. Sometimes you see trouble understanding metaphorical language. And one of the things that I think is kind of intriguing is right hemisphere patients often have trouble understanding jokes, even though they seem to kind of have a preserved sense of humor. Right, and so this has been revealed in neuropsychology tests like this one, right, where what they do is they give patients the setup to a joke, and then they give them an array of choices, and you're supposed to pick the ending that you think makes it the most funny, right? So a teenager's being interviewed for a summer job, you'll get $50 a week to start off, says his boss, then after a month, you'll get a raise to $75 a week. And so you can pick A, I'd like to take the job. When can I start? That's an ending that if you give an aphasic patient this kind of test, when they make mistakes, those are the kind of mistakes that they tend to make. They say something that's totally not funny, that just kind of fits with the context. And they're like, A. B, that's great. I'll come back in a month. That's actually the correct answer. Or if you said C, hey boss, your nose is too big for your face, you just might be a right hemisphere damage patient, right? So right hemisphere patients tend to appreciate the fact that a joke is supposed to be kind of a non sequitur from the setup, right? That there's supposed to be something kind of surprising about it. But they're unable to pick the joke ending that kind of connects in an alternative, with an alternative interpretation of the joke, right? And so the come back in a month here is supposed to refer to the fact that the person's gonna get a more money after a month. And so they're like, okay, I'll just come in for that It's big $75 a week, right? Okay, right. So right hemisphere patients have some trouble understanding semantic jokes like this one, which suggests that maybe the right hemisphere is involved in some way in joke comprehension. Okay, so when I first started on this research, I had a bunch of just really basic questions, right? And so the main sort of driving question is, well, what are the cognitive and neural processes that subserve frame shifting, right? This process that allows you to get a joke, right? Where you activate new background information in order to get the joke. And then kind of more concretely, what is the nature of right hemisphere involvement in this frame shifting process, right? And so operationally, we're going to look at a few, or I'll talk about a series of studies where we tried to identify particular research questions. So one of them, is there any kind of online real-time neural evidence for an asymmetric brain response to jokes? Right, so we're inferring that the right hemisphere is important for joke comprehension based on patient studies. Can we see any evidence for the involvement of the right hemisphere in healthy neurotypical adults? Another question is whether group differences in cerebral asymmetry have any physiological implications for joke processing. So again, this is trying to verify the connection between right hemisphere involvement and frame shifting. And then the final question that I'll look at if we get time for it is whether differences in semantic activation in the two hemispheres affects joke comprehension. So some people have proposed that you have two slightly different semantic networks, one in the left hemisphere and one in the right hemisphere. And so I'll look at some data that puts that hypothesis to the test and looks at whether it's relevant for differences in joke comprehension across the two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, and all the studies I'll talk about, I believe, are event-related brain potential studies. This is a nice technique because it's relatively cheap. It gives you a real-time index of ongoing brain activity. It's mostly picking up on cortically generated activity, which is what we think is probably most relevant for understanding jokes. There are aspects of the ERPs that are sensitive to language comprehension processes, and ERPs are also sensitive to lateralized brain activity. So it's not the greatest technique for spatial localization of neural effects, but it is the case that you can see differences in the contribution or asymmetric contributions of the two hemispheres just by seeing differences in the relative amplitude on one side of the scalp versus the other. And so the way you get the ERP is you record someone's ongoing EEG during some kind of cognitive activity, and the way to pull out the most meaningful part of the EEG relevant to the cognitive process of interest is you have different kinds of cognitive events that you repeat. And the easiest way to kind of look at what is the temporally correlated aspect of brain activity with the process of interest is you just average the signal, right? So here the idea is this person is apparently interested in the neural processes that are associated with a flashing light, right? So dealing with a flashing light. And so you have the process you're interested in, this flashing light, and you repeat it multiple different times. And then you extract portions of the EEG that occur after the onset of that event of interest, like as each time the light comes on. And what's done is you just do a point-by-point average of the time series of the voltages in each time. And it turns out that if you do this averaging process, even though in terms of signal processing, it's super simplistic, you get a series of positive and negative peaks, and it seems like there are it's easy to correlate particular kinds of cognitive processing with different aspects of this brainwave signal, these event-related potentials, right? So there are all these named ERP components that have been related to different aspects of perceptual, cognitive, and motor processing. And in particular, we are capitalizing on the fact that there are a number of known language ERP effects, most notably the N400. And the way that these data plots work is time unfolds on the x-axis here, and the y-axis, which is totally unlabeled for you guys, is voltage. So it's microvolts of activity recorded from the scalp. And by convention, we plot negative voltage up. And this is especially handy if you're looking at the N400, because if negative voltage is plotted up, the bigger the wave, the bigger the N400 component. So we're kind of backwards in that respect. And so the N400 is called N400 because it's a negative going wave, and it peaks about 400 milliseconds after the onset of a word that you're reading. It's observed for quite a long period of time though, right? So the negativity actually starts about 200 milliseconds after a word comes on, and it lasts until 700 milliseconds oftentimes. It's known to be related to meaning processing because of the kinds of experimental modulations that can change its size, right? So N400 is bigger for nouns and verbs, so-called content words, than it is for short function words that play mainly a grammatical role, right? So it's going to be bigger for a word like baseball than a word like the. N400 is also big when something doesn't really fit with the context, right? So I take my coffee with cream and dog will elicit a big N400, whereas I take my coffee with cream and sugar will elicit a very small N400. And it's also modulated by what's called closed probability, where if you ask people to complete a sentence with the first word that comes to mind, that is the closed probability of the number of people that come up with a particular word in a particular sentence context is the closed probability of the word, right? So predictable words elicit very small N400s, and unpredictable words elicit big N400s. Here, what's shown is a closed probability manipulation, right, where the black line shows you the N400 elicited by the word sugar in a sentence context where it's expected, like I take my coffee with cream and sugar. And then the red line is N400 elicited by a word like NutraSweet. And if you don't know, NutraSweet is a artificial sweetener that was used, I don't know, 100 years ago when I was a kid. And I don't know, it might cause cancer or something, but I don't think they use it anymore. Whatever. But it's a plausible continuation of the sentence. It's not like coffee with cream and dog, but it's not a word that anyone's really necessarily expecting. So it elicits a slightly larger N400 than a word like sugar. And so the size of the N400 is an index of the difficulty of lexical integration or semantic retrieval, right? So how hard is it to activate the information that you need to understand that word in that context? The bigger it is, the harder it is to understand the word. Okay, so the first study that I want to talk about here, the goal was just to identify some ERP indices of frame shifting needed for joke comprehension, and to see if there were any lateralized ERP effects that would suggest an asymmetric contribution of the two cerebral hemispheres to this process. Okay, and so to look at this, I went through a bunch of old joke books and pulled out some jokes. And the jokes differed in something called sentence constraint. So some of the jokes sort of promoted a particular last word, right? So people had more definite expectations about how the sentence would end. Sorry, some of these jokes are a little sexist. I asked the woman at the party if she remembered me from last year, and she said she never forgets. Most people are expecting the word face in this context. And the joke ending is actually, she never forgets a dress. And it should be funny if you find it funny, because there is this thing that women aren't supposed to wear the same dress to multiple parties. Like, I guess they're supposed to buy a new dress every time they go to a cocktail party or something. It's like definitely this early 1960s it seems to be like when this joke was coined. So the joke ending here was dress, and this would require like a frame shift to get into like all these stereotypes about what women are supposed to wear to parties, versus the so-called straight ending, which is name. So name isn't a word that you're expecting in this context, but it kind of fits with the overall frame evoked by the sentence of she has a really good memory, and she doesn't forget things. And then we also had these low constraint jokes. So these are jokes where the ending you get is kind of surprising, but there's no particular word that everyone was expecting, right? So my husband took the money we were saving to buy a new car and blew it all at because there's lots of different ways to blow money. If you give this sentence to people on a close task, they come up with lots and lots of different last words. So the joke is movies, and I don't know if that's supposed to be funny because you weren't saving very much money, or because movies are really expensive. I guess it depends probably how much money you have and whatever. I don't know. So our non-joke control ending was tables, because a lot of the things people filled in that they were expecting were gambling related. So tables was not a word that anyone actually generated on the close task. So it's an unexpected word, but it kind of fit with the overall gambling frame evoked by the context. Okay, so here are the data. And so you can see that whether it was a high constraint or a low constraint sentence context mattered somewhat in terms of what the effect of the jokes were. Each graph is a different electrode, and the graphs at the top of the figure are from the front of the head, and the bottom of the figure are the back of the head, and left is left and right is right. And so we were kind of expecting to get an N400 effect, and we did in the high constraint jokes. In the low constraint jokes, it seems like there's a little bit of a trend there for an N400, but it wasn't significant. So if there's anything there, it's much smaller than it is in the high constraint jokes. We also got late positivities, right? So there's a more positive response to the jokes over the back of the head for the high constraint jokes, and more over the front and the central part of the head for the low constraint jokes. So late positivities tend to index kind of surprise. And then the joke that seems to be the most related to actually the frame shifting process required to get a joke is this anterior left kind of low frequency negativity for the jokes. So this is very focused over, a particular portion of the scalp that suggests the generator is pretty close to the electrodes where we saw it. And we see it both for the high constraint jokes and for the low constraint jokes. And the reason that I think that this is definitely relevant for the frame shifting process was that if you contrast people who did well on the comprehension questions that followed each stimulus with the people who did less well, the people who were getting the jokes were the ones who showed the effect, and the people who didn't get the jokes You can see their ERPs in this comparison look just completely different from these guys. Right. So overall, the ERP indices of joke processing here were that for the high constraint joke, we saw an enhanced N400 and a late positive complex. And for the low constraint jokes, we got a late frontocentral positivity. Right. So there's not necessarily a canonical response to jokes. It seems to depend a lot on how firm your expectations are and how much you need to revise in order to understand them. The ERP index of frame shifting was this sustained negativity. Whether or not we got lateralized ERP effects, well, all of the effects we saw were lateralized one way or the other. The N400, oops, it was lateralized to the right, but most data suggests the N400 is actually primarily generated from the left hemisphere. It's just something to do with the orientation of the dipoles, but the fact that it's lateralized suggests that one side of the brain is more important than the other. The LPC was also lateralized to the right, and the sustained negativity, the thing that seems to be most relevant for understanding the jokes, was evident over only a few left anterior sites. So it's likely that that's actually a left hemisphere brain activity that is registering. So this is the first study. Do you guys have any questions at this point?
Not from me.
All right. Well, I can just forge ahead then. All right. So the second study is kind of building on these findings. What we were interested in here was in whether there were differences in the brain response of left-handers versus right-handers for joke comprehension, right? And the reason that we thought that handedness might be relevant is that handedness is known to be relevant for hemispheric asymmetry, right? And particularly for language function. So there are some known anatomical differences between left-handers and right-handers that are presumably relevant for these kinds of processes. One of them is that the corpus callosum, the structure, the white matter tracts that connect the two hemispheres together tend to be larger in left-handers than in right-handers. And so larger corpora callosa would promote more hemispheric cooperation. Another thing that's particularly relevant for speech comprehension is the planum temporale. So this is part of the temporal lobe. It's sort of the top part of the temporal lobe. It's an area important for recognizing phonemes and speech sounds. And in right-handers, this is a highly asymmetric structure, right? So the planum temporale in the left hemisphere has a greater area than the planum temporale in the right hemisphere. In left-handers, by contrast, there's much less of an asymmetry. They seem to be, they tend to be much closer to the same size. And just generally, there are it seems to be the case that hemispheric specialization is much more prominent in right-handers in general than it is in left-handers. So it's less that left-handers have an opposite kind of specialization than that they're just less likely to have this strong left lateralized motor control and left lateralized language control, right? So left-handers tend to be more ambidextrous than right-handers, and there's presumably multiple causes for that, right? So it could be that being left-handed is part of this kind of genetic set for having less hemispheric specialization, but there's also cultural pressures. Since most people are right-handed, the world is kind of configured for right-handed people. And so left-handers tend to get a lot of experience using their right hand to do everyday tasks like I'm actually kind of left-handed. And when I was a kid, I thought that scissors were this cruel thing. I'm like, why does everybody else find these scissors so hard to use? And like, I was using the wrong hand with the scissors. And they don't cut if you, for some reason, if you're using your left hand and you cut with a pair of scissors, they don't cut. And somebody's like, hold them with the other hand, you idiot. And I was like, oh, okay. So anyway. That's irrelevant. Okay, so there are these known differences in hemispheric asymmetry, and the question is, do these impact joke comprehension? Right, and so the thinking was, well, if left-handed people have more bilateral language representation, does this impact the way they process figurative language phenomena that are known to have right hemisphere involvement, right? So in particular, does it change the way that they process jokes? Okay, so in study 2, the questions that motivated us was, do the ERPs elicited by jokes differ in left-handers and right-handers? And is there any evidence of less lateral asymmetry in the lefties' brainwaves? And so the materials included sentences that ended either as jokes or with equally unexpected straight endings that were consistent with the contextually evoked frame, right? So the joke here is a replacement player hit a home run with my girl. And then the straight ending is a replacement player hit a home run with my ball. And so if you don't play baseball, the word that people would be presumably expecting is with my bat, because that's what you hit with. So ball is an unexpected word, but it fits with the baseball frame that's kind of evoked by the sentence. Right, so we're trying to control for the fact that a joke has an unexpected ending and capture the fact that the joke requires frame shifting, but the straight ending doesn't. Okay, and so we had, what do we have? 16 left-handers and 16 right-handers. They were not controlled. Laterality quotient is a way of measuring how left-handed or how right-handed people are. And it goes from plus 100 for super strongly right-handed to minus 100 for super strongly left-handed. And so you can see that the right-handers are more right-handed than the left-handers are left-handed. And that seems to be just kind of how it is if you sample left-handers and right-handers, that left-handers tend to fall closer to the ambidextrous side of the scale, even if you're recruiting people specifically saying like, we're looking for left-handers. Do you know any left-handers? We want left-handers to come to our lab and wear an electrode cap and read some dated, somewhat sexist jokes. And so we administered some basic tests of language comprehension. So token test is a test given to aphasic patients. It captures your ability to kind of follow instructions and do basic parsing. Semantic relations is your ability to kind of just understand basic kinds of sentences. And the vocabulary test is a test of vocabulary. It's actually designed for children, so most adults do pretty well. And so our two groups were fairly well matched in these basic tests of language comprehension, and they had similar demographics, similar education. The main difference was some were left-handed, some were right-handed. And so here are the data. So in these jokes, we had a lot more jokes in the materials than in the first study that I talked about, where it was mostly boring sentences that you get in a language study with just a few jokes thrown in there. Here we had half of the materials were jokes and half were joke controls. And it turns out when you have lots and lots of jokes, the N400 effects you see for some jokes tend to get washed out by late positivities. And actually in this sample for these jokes, the main effect in the right-handers was again this left anterior slow negativity, right, where you see a more negative response for the joke endings than the straight endings. But that effect is entirely absent in the left-handers. And instead, what we see is this positivity that you can see here over these central sites. And it starts around the same time as the sustained negativity here, but it's a positivity. And it's not as highly lateralized. It seems to be a tiny bit bigger on the right than the left, but it's fairly symmetric. And these positivities tend to require interhemispheric transfer. And so our speculation was that with the supposed larger corpora callosa in the left-handers, that you have more interhemispheric communication than you have in the right-handers. So the right-handers, whatever process that this sustained negativity is indexing, was happening pretty much exclusively in the left hemisphere, whereas this other process indexed by this effect seems to involve some interhemispheric communication. So even though both groups of people were doing a good job of understanding the jokes, it wasn't like, oh, well, we know that people who don't get jokes don't show that effect. These guys actually got the jokes, but they just show a very different pattern in the brainwave. So it's pretty cool. So the slow sustained joke effects in the right-handers, it was a left anterior negativity. In the left-handers, it was a frontocentral positivity. And so the highly lateralized brain response in the right-handers was not evident in the left-handers ERPs. So that's consistent with the idea that right-handers have more hemispheric specialization and left-handers are less specialized. And so the way that they deal with these high-level language phenomena that have to do that the right hemisphere has been implicated in seems to be by doing interhemispheric cooperation. So a different way of carrying out the same cognitive process. So before I go on to the next study, do you guys have any questions about the handedness business?
Is like that. So do you think that difference is just because it's like what left-handers are like with their brain, or do you think it's just because left-handed people have to use a lot of right-handed stuff, so it's just like, I guess, developing your brain that way?
Yeah, I mean, because it's a language comprehension task, I think, nobody forces you to use one hemisphere or the other to do language comprehension. So I really think that, the one group of people their brains were just doing something pretty different. So it was a bigger effect than I anticipated. I sort of thought like, oh, maybe it'll be skewed a little bit one way for the one group and skewed the opposite way for the other group. But to see like a negativity in one group and a positivity in another group, like that's a qualitative difference. So yeah, this would have been a good study to do with fMRI, because you could see, what are the actual areas that are getting recruited in the left-handers versus the right-handers. But I never was able to get a grant to do that. So all right, are we good there? Okay. Well, I'll talk about another way of getting at this question of hemispheric asymmetry and high-level language phenomena, which is to take advantage of the organization of the visual system. So when you're processing stuff that's in the center of gaze, it gets projected to both sides of the brain, and both sides of the brain are dealing with it. But when you're dealing with things in the left or the right periphery, it tends to, the projections are such that it's initially processed in the contralateral hemisphere. And so that's why, this circle here that's being processed by the left side of each eye is getting shuttled over to the right hemisphere, and this square here that's being processed by the right side of each eye is shuttled over to the left hemisphere, right? And so this has led researchers interested in hemispheric asymmetry to do this divided visual field paradigm, where you present a stimulus outside of the center of gaze very briefly so that the person doesn't have enough time to move their eyes and foveate it to where both hemispheres would get the stimulus. And so you can send it to just one side of the brain or just the other side of the brain. Of course, in most people, the two sides of the brain can communicate with one another. So the information gets sent over to the other hemisphere. But it seems that the initial delivery of the stimulus to one side of the brain results in that side of the brain doing the bulk of the processing of that stimulus. And so even though both sides of the brain ultimately get access to that information, if you do this divided visual field presentation paradigm, it results in an abnormally asymmetric processing of the stimulus. And so with language stimuli, people have used this Hemifield priming paradigm where you can present a stimulus, prime stimulus in the center of the screen, and then a target in either the left or the right hemifield, or you can present the prime in one of the hemifields and the target in the center and see the effects. And so it turns out that Hemifield priming results in slightly different patterns of results depending on which side of the brain sees the stimulus. So for strongly associated category members like sofa chair, you see priming with presentation to both the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. But for non-associated category members like lamp table, right, where lamp and table are both furniture, but they're not a word. Like if I say, oh, say the first word that comes to mind when I say lamp, you're not going to say table, right? So that's why they're non-associated. Right, so the right hemisphere shows priming for these kinds of pairs, but the left hemisphere doesn't. And then there's also typicality effects, right? So robin and crow are both typical kinds of birds. So robin can prime crow, whereas duck crow, because ducks are slightly atypical birds. They don't prime crow as much as robin does. So you see these typicality effects in the left hemisphere, but not in the right hemisphere. And so when I say in the left hemisphere, I just mean with the Hemifield priming paradigm. If the left hemisphere gets the stimulus, then you see these category typicality effects. And if the right hemisphere gets the stimulus, you don't. Right, so the conclusion from these kinds of priming paradigms is, well, maybe we have two different semantic networks, and they both are sensitive to, really strong relationships between words like sofa chair. But then each hemisphere kind of has specialized semantic relationships that it's tuned to, right? And so the left hemisphere is tuned to category structure, whereas the right hemisphere is tuned more to thematic associations, right? So lamps and tables are encountered in the same kinds of contexts. So maybe that's what the right hemisphere is kind of tuned to. And then there's a particular phenomenon known as summation priming that this guy Beeman, or he goes by Jung Beeman now, who's a professor at Northwestern. He's argued that this is relevant for why you see differences in the patterns of communication deficits in left versus right hemisphere patients. So summation priming is, you have a probe word like cut that's not related individually to any of the words foot, cry, or glass. But if you hear foot, cry, glass, and then you hear cut, you're like, oh, okay, that relates to all of them together, more so than snow, which is not related to any of them or to all of them together. And usually when you do these kinds of priming paradigms, the typical thing to find is like, oh, the left hemisphere just shows more sensitivity than the right hemisphere. But for summation priming, here they're looking at naming accuracy, so higher is better. So both hemispheres show some summation priming, but the priming effect is bigger when the right hemisphere got the stimulus. And they're like, you know, this summation priming, it's kind of like when you get a joke, right? That you're putting all these pieces together, and maybe the right hemisphere is sensitive to those kinds of relationships, more sensitive to those kinds of relationships than the left hemisphere is. And so Jung Beeman has proposed this coarse coding hypothesis, right, where the difference in the effects of left versus right hemisphere damage are due to differences in the underlying semantic networks in the left versus the right hemisphere, right? And so he says that there's patterns of semantic activations in the right hemisphere are crucial for the interpretation of figurative language, the kinds of things that tend to be damaged with right hemisphere strokes, right? So trouble getting jokes, the idea is that because the coarse coding is in the right hemisphere, if your right hemisphere is damaged, then you won't have access to those kinds of broad semantic activations, and it'll be more difficult to understand jokes, right? And so the idea is that semantic activation in the left hemisphere is very restricted. It's related to, you know, linguistically coded features maybe, and it's much more broad in the right hemisphere. And so cut, glass, foot have kind of overlapping semantic representations in the right hemisphere that give rise to this summation priming, whereas the left hemisphere would have more discrete representations of these things. So it's kind of a cool idea, but I'm not totally enthralled with the way that it's kind of formulated. And that's because I don't think that summation priming results because there's an overlap in the features of glass and cut and foot per se. But I think there's something more, more complicated going on, right? So like the idea of coarse coding, like as a metaphor, it's great, but I don't think that it actually really explains things. And I think that a better way of putting the difference between the semantic activations in the left versus the right hemisphere might have to do with the fact that, well, maybe the right hemisphere activates frames as opposed to simple definitions. And so there's a representation of causal and relational information in the right hemisphere that's much less prominent in the left hemisphere. And so this information might be really important for joke comprehension in particular. And that's why right hemisphere patients might have trouble understanding jokes. And so it's complicated, but it has testable implications. So if right hemisphere is involved in joke comprehension and the involvement in particular involves semantic activation, then the right hemisphere should show an advantage for the lexical integration of the punch word in a joke, right? And so this predicts that you will see smaller N400 joke effects with presentation to the right hemisphere than with presentation to the left hemisphere, right? So the idea is if you see an N400 for a joke that's bigger than for a joke control, and if you're activating information that's important for jokes, then you would actually have a smaller N400 than if you weren't activating information important for jokes. Right. And so to test this, what we did was have 3 different kinds of sentences. One were sentences where people read a last word that was very predictable from the sentence context. Our Newgreen car, block the narrow driveway. And this was sort of like as a baseline condition. And then we had these low close sentences, namely jokes like a replacement player hit a home run with my girl, and the non-joke control sentences where you have the same setup, but then a different sentence final word that's not funny and that's unexpected, but that doesn't require frame shifting. And so people would read these sentences one word at a time, just like our other experiments. Really fun, really fun. And then for the last word, they're supposed to fixate on the cross, and then the word pops up in either the right visual field here, where it would go to the left hemisphere, or in the left visual field, where it would go to the right hemisphere. And people are tempted to move their eyes, but the word is only on the screen for 200 milliseconds, and we kind of relentlessly browbeat the people. We can see when they move their eyes because we can put electrodes beside their eyes. We can see every time they move their eyes. And when they do it, we stop the experiment. We go in there and we say, you moved your eyes. If you can't control your eye movements, we're going to have to stop the experiment. And for some reason, this motivates people to fixate on the cross and not move their eyes. So if you are manipulative, and encouraging enough, you can get people to cooperate in this kind of a paradigm. It's pretty amazing what undergraduate volunteers can do. And so because particularly when the word is presented to the right hemisphere, people can't always read it. They're like, I think my left eye is weaker or something. I'm having trouble reading those words on the left. It's like, it's not your eye, it's your brain. Your brain has trouble reading stuff when it goes to your right hemisphere. So we asked people to say what the last word was to see if they were able to read it. And then we had them answer a comprehension question that tested whether or not they got the joke. And so here we have the data with the expected. That's the control sentences that were just kind of like, you got a last word that fit with the context. It's exactly the word you were probably expecting. And then we have the joke ending and the straight ending. And you can see that when the left hemisphere gets the stimulus first, you have a larger N400 response than when you get the straight ending, right? So this suggests that the left hemisphere finds the joke ending just a teeny tiny bit harder to understand than the straight ending. And by contrast, the right hemisphere, if anything, the straight ending elicits maybe a larger N400, but statistically, the brain response to those two kinds of stimuli was the same, right? So for the right hemisphere, it's an unexpected ending. It's harder to understand than that expected ending, but the joke ending was no harder to understand than the straight ending. Right, so these data fit with that coarse coding hypothesis, right? That says there's some difference in the semantic organization of the two hemispheres, because when the right hemisphere saw the stimulus, both kinds of endings seem to be equally difficult to incorporate. Whereas when the left hemisphere saw the stimulus, the joke ending was definitely more difficult to understand than the straight ending. So this suggests that the semantic activation in the right hemisphere actually makes it easier to understand the critical word in a joke than it might be otherwise. Okay. Do you guys have any questions after this one? It's almost time, but if you're skeptical, you'll want to stay on for one more experiment. But so this is kind of a complicated manipulation, right? Like left visual field, right visual field. What do the different N400 effects mean? But hopefully you're with me. Okay, I'm hearing no questions. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about the next experiment, because if you have doubts about the first experiment, I think that this will put them to rest. So in this next experiment, the question was, well, okay, we have pretty good evidence that the semantic representations in the two hemispheres might be a little bit different, but is that difference really relevant to joke comprehension? So is the right hemisphere activating joke relevant information in the way that I kind of hypothesized, right? That I'm saying, oh, it's activating causal and relational features that should help you understand the joke. Right, because we saw equivalent N400s, and I'm like, oh, it's just as easy to understand the joke ending as it is to understand the straight ending. But it could be not that it was easy to understand, but the right hemisphere was just confused. It was just generally confused. And so there was no difference between joke and straight endings because it just didn't really understand either ending. So to look at this, what we did was we looked at something we called joke-related priming. And so what we did was look at the brain response to a word like funds after it followed a joke, like my church welcomes all denominations but prefers 20s, versus a non-joke control, my church welcomes all denominations but prefers Mormons. Right, so the idea is that funds is something that's activated by the joke, right? So you have to understand that 20s here refers to $20 bills, but not to Mormons. And because it's perfectly controlled, except for the sentence final word is different in the two cases. And so we actually did a pretest where we showed people the last word, and then we lateralized the probe word to see if there was a difference in lexical priming from words like 20s that were the jokes versus words like Mormons that were the control words. And we got the same size, N400, for both kinds of words. Okay, and so then the question is, well, if you read the joke and then you get the probe word, is there going to be a difference in the size of the N400 if the left hemisphere sees the stimulus versus if the right hemisphere sees the stimulus? Right, and so early visual potentials, I probably should have talked about this in one of the earlier studies, but this is showing you what the lateralization manipulation does to the visual potentials that are evoked by the words, right? So this is the N1 and the P2 component, and you can see that when the left hemisphere gets the stimulus, the response over the right hemisphere is larger, and when the right hemisphere gets the stimulus, the response over the right hemisphere is larger. And there's actually the difference in the peak here, like when this peak it happens relative to when this peak happens, tells you something about the amount of time that it takes, or if you look, this is the same stimulus, right? You can look at when does this peak versus when is this red peak over here. And that tells you the time that it takes the stimulus information to be transferred from, in this case, the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere. Right, so the information is going from side to side. It's clearly getting, more of it's getting to the targeted hemisphere, and it gets there earlier, and it has long-lasting impact on the brain response to that word. Okay, so here are the N400 effects, right? So on the left, we have when the left hemisphere saw the stimulus, and on the right, we have when the right hemisphere saw the stimulus. And so this is always the same word. It's always going to be funds, but in one case, it's related, and in another case, it's unrelated, right? So it's coming after a joke, or it's coming after a straight version. And so it's eliciting a bigger N400 when it's unrelated than when it's related, but that joke-related priming effect, right? The fact that you have a smaller N400 when it follows the joke than when it follows the straight version, that joke priming effect is smaller when the left hemisphere gets it than when the right hemisphere gets it, right? And so that tells you that actually the right hemisphere had activated more joke-related information than left-related. And so it could benefit from the fact that the word was related to the meaning evoked by the joke. So that's pretty cool, right? Because in the first study, there was a null effect with presentation to the right hemisphere and an effect with presentation to the left hemisphere. And in this study, we see a bigger effect with presentation to the right hemisphere than with presentation to the left hemisphere. And then this is just so that, you know, I don't want to disrespect the left hemisphere. There was actually an effect in the left hemisphere that you don't even see when the right hemisphere gets the stimulus. And that's this frontal positivity that is presumably relevant to kind of getting, seeing the relationship between the probe word and what came before. And so you see it early and prominently when the left hemisphere gets the stimulus, and only very late when the right hemisphere gets the stimulus. And frankly, this is the kind of effect that you expect to see if the right hemisphere triggered the effect after interhemispheric, you know, cooperation. So it's like, oh, once the left hemisphere got this stimulus information, then this effect starts to percolate up. So. Right, so in some experiment 3, the N400 seems to reflect joke-related priming. And so the fact that we saw a larger N400 presentation to the left visual field right hemisphere suggests that joke-related information was actually more active in the right hemisphere, consistent with the coarse coding hypothesis and very consistent with our formulation of it. And then that right visual field frontal positivity, we don't really know exactly what it indexes. It could be saying like, oh, this information needs to be considered more. It could be like suppressing irrelevant information. It could be trying to see what is the connection between this word fund and what came before. But the interesting thing is it seems to be triggered by the left hemisphere. And so it could be that, you know, even though the right hemisphere seems to have joke-related information kind of activated early on, that actually really getting the joke and understanding how the different parts of the joke relate to one another might actually involve left hemisphere activity. So I have a whole other experiment, but it's getting kind of late. So I think I'm just gonna, I mean, if you guys wanna ask me about the puns, I can go back and recap. But I think I'll wrap it up there and see if there are any questions. And of course, if you want to hear about puns, you know, it'll be like another 5 to 10 minutes. But I think that's kind of plenty for you guys to stew on.
Yeah, it was an interesting talk.
50 crazy things I did with jokes.
I mean, it's interesting because when I used to think about research, it was like I never really thought about researching jokes, but I think that's something that's really interesting to do.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I had been working in linguistics and philosophy, and I was like, oh, it'd be really cool to kind of do something more experimental, more physiological. And so I read this thing by Minsky, and it was about like using frames and understanding jokes. And I was like, oh, I could study joke comprehension. I could like look at people's brain activity while they're understanding jokes. And so it was a nice way for me to transition from theoretical research to more kind of empirically motivated research. And it's, you know, kind of a fun topic.
Yeah. When I took 112, that was pretty interesting. The humor class.
Oh yeah, I still have to see the syllabus for that. It sounds like a good class.
I think Jeff's in 112 right now. He could send you the
Yeah,
syllabus.
and Abby is as well. One of the papers is by you and Dr. Kudus.
Oh,
It's
okay.
about frame shifting, actually. So, you know, it's kind of like, ah, ha, ha, right at the beginning there. But
oh, so is that the 1999 paper?
I think so. I could check real quick, but it's you and Dr. Kudus basically defining frame shifting. So yeah.
Yeah. You should guest lecture in 112 sometime. That'd be pretty cool. I took 112 last spring, so.
Cool.
But yeah, thank you for having this talk with us.
Great, great. All right. Yeah. Well, if people want to follow up with me offline, I'm easy to find. S. Coulson at UCSD. Yeah. Okay. Stop my share.
But yeah, I'm going to stop the recording now.
Oh, you're